Hello everyone, Tristan here for TZ Longsword and Squinting Rabbit Productions. 2020 has been a rough year for everyone. General health and safety issues aside, the HEMA community's training paradigm has seen a massive shift towards a lot more solo practice and more online instruction.
Once you are crossing that threshold, you should be doing something aggressive towards the other person.
A little over a year ago, I had developed a brand new test cutting workshop and had been planning on teaching it at multiple HEMA events both in the States and abroad. But, as the fates had it, everything got cancelled. In an effort to make up for that and give people some new ideas on practice methodology, we at Squinting Rabbit decided to film the workshop to make it accessible online.
Roll 5, scene D7, take 2, mark.
Before we begin, however, I just want to mention two things. First, although this workshop will involve test cutting, at its core it's about cutting mechanics and application, so you won't actually need tatami or even a sharp sword to run these drills. Second, some supplemental material and 3 additional drills will be accessible only for donors on our Patreon. These are slightly more advanced drills and build off principles I usually only teach in person. For access, see the link in the video description below. Let's get started. Test cutting, for our purposes, is a test of operator skill, not of the sword itself. Cutting skills ought to be consistent across all modes of training. Those are technical practice, or let's call it drilling, application of technique in opposition, or sparring, and of course test cutting, which is basically a form of quality assurance for all the techniques you practice all the time. I've said this plenty of times in plenty of videos, but once again, if it's your intent to be a well-rounded martial artist, there's no benefit to teaching yourself 3 different ways of doing any one thing. Test cutting in conjunction with a sincere analysis of body mechanics can help refine technique in a way that the artificiality of drilling, or the chaos of sparring, just can't. Speaking of artificiality, as a beginner, it is necessary to limit as many variables as possible to be able to focus only on the mechanics of cutting. This is a normal part of learning new skill sets. Yet, it's also a very common complaint repeated by naysayers in the HEMA community, who think that test cutting has no place in a practice regime, since it bears little or no resemblance to realistic sword combat. In a sense, they're not wrong. This is not the fault of the practice method, however. The community is still, to a large extent, in that beginner phase, cutting with limited variables, and perhaps unsure of how to progress from there. Logically, as one's fundamental skills improve, these variables must be reintroduced. But what does this actually mean? Well, to whatever extent possible, the testing medium should no longer be treated as a passive target, but rather as an active, armed opponent. To this end, we have to consider more than just the cuts in isolation. This should include the approach, the withdrawal, and everything in between, including defensive actions, multiple offensive actions made in succession, psychologically manipulative actions, contingencies for failure, etc. This workshop will focus on the incorporation of many of these elements rather than simply approaching test cutting with the binary mindset of the beginner, that is, to either succeed or fail a cut. Remember, these drills are suggestions, neither prescriptive nor exhaustive. Ultimately, it's important to make these drills fit your art and your expression of that art. Also, as I mentioned before, these drills can and should be practiced without any cutting medium. We'll be demonstrating without tatami first, using a marker on the ground to help gauge distance. I prefer this method over using a pel or striking target, since the students are able to cut through, rather than just impacting against a solid surface. Yet, distance management remains a factor, as any technique done too far away is a waste of energy, and any technique done too close is also too late. Let's start simply, with a slow, smooth approach to the target. The key here is to strike without hesitation as soon as you cross that threshold from a safe distance into the danger zone. This is zufechting, or coming into measure, into range, etc. When practicing this, and all the drills, you should begin at slightly different distances away, so it doesn't just become an exercise in counting steps to the target. Rather, it should force you to learn how to adjust the length or frequency of your steps. You can also try accelerating slightly across the threshold, so long as you remain stable and balanced. Accelerate, but don't rush. Just like a smooth and perhaps surprising entry into striking range is beneficial, so is having an exit strategy. This can involve retreating backwards, or stepping obliquely or laterally. But the idea here is as soon as the strike is complete, get back out of range again. Remember though, not to be too flighty. If you exit before you've actually finished the strike, you're likely to cause that strike to fail. You could just run out of sword by shifting back too soon, but, especially if you're moving obliquely, you run the risk of changing your cutting trajectory and getting stuck in the target. First things first, cut, then get out of the way. Next, we're going to work on what I call here physical recovery. By this I mean some sort of parrying action, and there are plenty of reasons for doing this. Maybe you've missed your first strike, or it wasn't enough to incapacitate your opponent. Don't just stand there, defend yourself. Or maybe your strike was successful, but the opponent is dying at you, sword in hand. Defend yourself. Yes, this is a bit like shadowboxing, where now you need to start imagining the opponent and what they could be doing to you. Remember, fencing is not just about what you're trying to do. For the purposes of this drill, I'm encouraging students to use bad parries, or defensive actions with little or no immediate offensive component. The reason is, single-time defensive-offensive techniques are high-risk, high-reward. Bad parries are fundamentally safer structurally, and quicker to perform in an oh shit situation like these, when you just need to recover, get out, and live to try again. While I'm talking about recovering from strikes, I'd also like to take a moment to talk about recovering from test cutting fails. Sometimes you get stuck in tatami. It happens, for a myriad of reasons that I'm not going to cover here. A good habit to get into, which is as much about maintaining, let's say, presence of mind as it is a physical action, is to attempt to free your sword as though you're withdrawing from a thrust. A sharp backwards motion, maintaining the alignment of the blade in its attempted cut, coupled with a physical retreat, should get your sword unstuck and yourself out of harm's way. This is, in fact, much easier said than done, but I believe that this is a much more productive and realistic way of dealing with failures. Finally, we come to what I'm calling psychological recovery. This is perhaps the hardest to explain well, but in essence, it's keeping a threat projected forwards. How I usually describe it is, I've struck you once, don't make me do it again. Physically speaking, what we're practicing is recovering into a position, a guard, leg or posta or whatever, that threatens an immediate follow-up attack. The trick here, if you can call it that, is selling the idea of that second strike without actually performing it, imbuing your posture with intent, rather than simply just moving your sword from place to place. This is about body language, and it's intrinsic to the communicative, manipulative aspect of martial arts. To use a Japanese term here, this is zanshin. Although there's no direct analog to zanshin in Western martial traditions that I'm currently aware of, I feel strongly that it's something that should be considered, explored, and extrapolated. These are the 4 main drills that I wanted to cover in this workshop. Yes, they appear to be somewhat simplistic, but I promise you that if you're practicing mindfully and staying attentive to all the little details that are involved, things like timing your footfalls with your sword motions, reducing lag and other inefficiencies, especially as you change directions with the sword, there is so much here that can be worked on, deconstructed, and refined. And, as I said earlier, these are just suggestions for how to begin increasing the relevance of your test cutting into your practice regime. This is not the end of the road, and I promise you things can and will get more complex as we collectively get more and more proficient in our sword arts. Until we can work together in person, practice well. As promised, there's some supplementary material, including some of my ideas on strike efficiency and 3 more drills, available exclusively on the Squinting Rabbit Patreon. Click the link in the video description below for access. If you're watching this on Patreon already, thank you, and keep watching.